Welcome to Sleepy Middle Ages. Tonight we journey through flickering torchlight and shadowed stone corridors to uncover why medieval folks feared mirrors and what happened when moonlight slipped silently across their floors. You're not in your own bed anymore. Instead, imagine a world where a reflection isn't a casual glance, but a potential encounter with something else. Where moonlight isn't soft or romantic, it's suspicious, unpredictable, and maybe a little mad. You probably won't survive this, by the way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time is it right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a modest chamber with crumbling plaster and thick oak beams overhead. A single candle flickers beside your cot, casting a jittery glow across a piece of polished glass propped on a rickety stand. You didn't ask for the mirror. It came with the room, and it faces your bed. You shift your gaze, pretending not to see it, but its presence prickles. Its reflection captures more than it should your breath, hanging in the air, a faint flicker of something moving that the candle didn't cause. Back in the Middle Ages, a mirror wasn't just decoration. It was a rare, unsettling luxury. Most were made of polished metal copper or bronze, sometimes obsidian. When glass mirrors began appearing in wealthier homes, they were often small, imperfect, and disturbingly warped. You didn't see yourself clearly. You saw a version of yourself you couldn't quite trust, kind of like looking at your phone camera in the wrong lighting, only this time, your soul might be involved. Historical records from as early as the 12th century mention devil's glass, an early term for mirrors that seemed to show more than reality. One 13th century monk wrote that a polished face may gaze upon itself, but see what the Lord did not place there. That's a monk's way of saying this mirror's up to something. Mirrors, after all, reflect light. But in a world with dim torches and sputtering candles, reflections could seem to take on a life of their own. A delayed flicker, a misaligned shadow, and the very human tendency to see faces where there are none. It's called pareidolia today, but back then it was a warning. There's a belief that spread through rural parts of France and the Germanic states that your reflection wasn't just an image, it was your other self. And if that self ever broke away, you'd fall into illness, or worse. One tale still preserved in local Alsatian folklore tells of a woman who covered all her mirrors after her husband fell sick. She believed his spirit had been leaked through the glass. Mainstream history notes that mirror superstition had roots in both Christian teachings and older pagan ones. Christianity, for example, linked mirrors with vanity and pride. Remember the sin that got Lucifer kicked out. Meanwhile, older traditions believed that polished surfaces could act as portals to the spirit world. Combine those, and you get a household object that no one really wants to stare into alone. You've probably heard the 7 years of bad luck if you break a mirror. That belief actually dates back to the Romans. But medieval Europeans took it further. Break a mirror, and you didn't just mess with luck, you possibly shattered a link between your body and soul. Some even believed that every reflection stolen from a mirror left a piece of your spirit behind. Lose too many pieces, and you'd either die or become something else. Not exactly a bathroom selfie situation, But it wasn't just breaking mirrors that caused problems. Staring too long was said to invite danger, especially at night, especially by candlelight. The phrase, "don't gaze into the devil's window," appears in a 14th century English household guide, right above tips for keeping beetles out of flour, practical and paranormal. Why such fear? Because of the stories. In folktales passed orally from village to village, mirrors become characters. In one, a blacksmith's apprentice sees a man standing behind him in the mirror, only to turn and find nothing. He turns back, and the figure's closer. The next morning, the apprentice is found wandering, eyes cloudy, unable to speak. Moonstruck, they say, but the mirror gone. Historians still argue whether these mirror tales came primarily from religious dogma or from earlier Indo-European spirit traditions. Some claim the fears were reinforced by church teachings about spiritual warfare, evil entering through the senses. Others say it's just the darkness messing with everyone's heads. A quirky belief from the Carpathian regions held that mirrors should be turned to the wall during thunderstorms, not because of lightning, but because spirits moved most easily during electrical storms and might slip through reflections. Sort of like a supernatural pop-up ad. You're still in the room, that mirror still watches. Maybe the flicker you saw was a mouse, or the ghost of someone who stared too long and slipped inside. Medieval folks wouldn't question it. They'd cover the mirror with black cloth and mutter a prayer. You might just grab your phone and Google weird mirror flicker, which is fair, but just remember your screen's a mirror too in the right light. You wake in the middle of the night, not from sound but from light. A pale beam has crept through the crooked wooden shutters and now rests across the floor like a frozen blade. It slices upward across your blanket and lands right on your chest. You don't need to move to know what it is. The moon is out, and suddenly the room feels colder. In the medieval mind, moonlight wasn't a gentle glow or a romantic muse. It was a silent, eerie force, one that could creep into your body, twist your mind, and leave you altered. That's why moonlight appears in so many medieval tales as an agent of change. You go to sleep one person and wake up something else. The term lunatic comes from the Latin luna, meaning moon. Even mainstream historical texts from the period treat the moon not just as a celestial object, but as a trigger for madness. Physicians in the 13th and 14th centuries genuinely believed that exposure to the moon, especially during full moons, could disturb a person's humors, the bodily fluids believed to govern temperament. Too much moonlight might elevate black bile, they said, and result in melancholy or delirium. You know, standard moonbeam problems. You've probably laughed at werewolves and silver bullets, but people in the Middle Ages didn't. To them, the moon wasn't just symbolic of transformation, it caused it. You might not sprout fur and claws, but you might start walking at night, muttering, seeing things no one else could see, maybe even attacking someone in your sleep. All of these were documented and feared, and moonlight through windows, that was the most dangerous of all. They called it piercing light. There's a recorded folk practice in Wales, as late as the 15th century, where children's cradles were turned away from windows on nights of the full moon. Parents whispered that the moon could steal the child's thoughts, and sometimes children left under its glow would wake with glassy eyes and speak in tongues, or so the stories went. A particularly strange belief comes from Brittany, where people thought moonlight could cause your bones to soften. This led to a popular village warning: don't stand too long in moonlight or your legs will fold. Historians still argue whether this comes from rickets-related folklore or a symbolic fear of weakness, but in either case, it's not something villagers joked about. There's even a medical manuscript from 1392 that describes a condition called luna morbus, a kind of night fever believed to be triggered by moonlight. The cure: sleeping in total darkness with a protective stone placed under the tongue. Garnet if you could afford it, pebble if you couldn't. And then there's the moon's tie to the supernatural. In Slavic regions, stories tell of the Navia, restless spirits who rise under full moons, drawn to bodies bathed in moonlight. These spirits weren't evil necessarily, but they were known to be curious, and they liked to swap places with the living. If you left a window open on a moonlit night, you might wake up not quite yourself, or not wake up at all. It wasn't just peasants and herbalists peddling this fear. Even the church, with all its emphasis on God's light, warned against excessive exposure to lunar glow. There are recorded sermons that liken the moon's pale fire to Satan's imitation of divine illumination. It looks like light, feels like light, but leads to darkness. Poetic and terrifying. One fringe belief popular among certain alchemists and mystics claimed that the moon was not reflecting sunlight, but casting its own corrupted version of it. That its light carried residue from the sins of the world, mirrored back onto us in pale beams. According to one 14th century mystic, the moon was the eye of forgotten angels, weeping poison. Bit of a downer for your night strolls, huh? A light joke here. Even medieval cats seemed to know the moon was trouble. There are entire collections of paintings, admittedly very dramatic, showing cats howling not at the moon like wolves, but to it, as if confessing. Maybe they were just annoyed that moonbeams disrupt their nap schedule, but you can't deny the vibe. And then there were the moon rites. These weren't your organized, high and mighty cathedral affairs. These were quiet, shrouded rituals performed in woods or cellars, often by women. Bathing in moonlight, whispering charms, burying charms in the garden. Historians debate whether these were witchcraft pagan holdovers or simply misunderstood folk medicine, but participants believed the moon amplified power, both healing and harmful. You start to wonder, lying there, what the moon has seen, what it remembers, if it carries with it some memory of every field bathed in blood, every prayer whispered in desperation, every unspoken regret spilled under its glow. The moon is old, older than your kingdom, older than your bones. Maybe that's why it unnerves you. And unlike the sun, it doesn't announce itself. It just appears, quiet, cold, watching. So when the medieval mind turned toward the moon, it wasn't with awe, it was with caution. You didn't walk alone under it. You didn't sleep with it on your face. And you certainly didn't trust anyone acting strange during its peak. The safest move: stay indoors. Keep the shutters closed. Pray it passes without incident. Because when something that distant touches your skin without permission, it's never just light. The next morning, you overhear two washerwomen whispering behind the tavern. One clutches her apron tightly, eyes darting toward the edge of the woods. She saw the witch in her mirror again, the older one says. Same night as the full moon. You keep walking, but the chill on your neck doesn't leave. In medieval towns, mirrors weren't just tools, they were traps. Not only for the unwary, but for the accused. If you were a woman who lived alone, owned odd herbs, or heaven forbid spoke Latin, you were already suspicious. But add a mirror to your wall that was practically a confession. You might as well hang a sign saying, "Witch lives here, please interrogate harshly." Villagers feared that witches could use mirrors, not only to scry or cast spells, but also to trap souls, especially the souls of children. Some believed that if a witch looked at you through a mirror, she could bind your spirit with her gaze. Eye contact in glass became a weapon. A 14th century chronicle from a Saxon monastery describes a mirror charm supposedly found in the belongings of an executed woman. It was a shard of obsidian wrapped in deer hide with symbols scratched into the surface. The monk wrote, "They say she used it to summon the faces of those she cursed. When she named them, they came knocking before the next moon." He also noted that the mirror had since vanished, comforting. What's odd is that this wasn't fringe thinking. Entire communities shared these beliefs. In parts of Italy and Spain, even physicians carried small hand mirrors for diagnostic reasons, but when someone fell ill after being examined, the mirrors were often smashed and buried. Historians still argue whether mirror-based accusations were stoked more by religious paranoia or surviving pagan folk practices. Some claim the church merely redirected pre-Christian mirror fears into anti-witch hysteria. Others say fear of mirrors was more about control, distrusting women's tools for reflection, self-examination, and autonomy. It's worth noting that in ancient times, mirrors were seen as sacred. In Egypt, they symbolized the sun's power, but by the Middle Ages, they'd slipped into shadow, too reflective, too revealing. It was dangerous to know yourself too well, especially if you were a woman. Introspection bordered on heresy. A quirky little record from the Black Forest tells of a girl who was forbidden to keep a mirror in her room lest she see her future and marry wrongly. The idea was that young women could use mirrors not just for vanity, but to see things glimpses of their fates, or worse, their true natures. And we all know how medieval folks felt about people knowing too much. You might be wondering, did people really think mirrors could show the future? Absolutely. Mirror scrying was a known practice. Practitioners claimed they could see distant places, uncover secrets, even find lost objects through reflected images. It wasn't officially sanctioned, of course. Most who practiced it did so quietly at night, behind shuttered windows, especially when the moon was full. That's when supposedly the mirror's power peaked. Moonlight on glass was said to open the gate. The mirror became a surface, yes, but also a veil. You didn't just see what was, you risked seeing what should not be. Children were warned about this. There are preserved lullabies from Old Norse and Gaelic traditions that include lines like, "Don't let the moonlight see your face. Don't let the mirror show your trace." These weren't poetic flourishes, they were practical instructions. Mirrors were covered at night, or turned to face the wall. It was easier than explaining why your child screamed every time they saw their reflection after sundown. Even architecture played a part. In some manors, mirrors were built with hinged covers like tiny cabinets, not for decoration, so they could be shut during sensitive hours. In castles, mirrors might be hidden entirely during certain phases of the moon. It was believed that the glass itself remembered what it reflected and might reveal unwanted truths during the wrong hour. And remember, we're not talking modern mirrors here. These weren't clean, crisp sheets of reflective glass. They were wavy, distorted surfaces full of ripples and dark spots. A smudge could look like a face. A flash of light might resemble movement. It's like living in a haunted funhouse, only with plague and feudalism. One case mentioned in a court document from 1428 involved a mirror that supposedly spoke. A girl claimed she heard whispers while combing her hair. The voice warned her of a neighbor's betrayal. When she repeated this in public, the neighbor was beaten. Later, the mirror was burned in a churchyard just to be safe. Whether or not you believe in spirits or magic, it's easy to understand the fear. In a world with no electricity, no science textbooks, and a deeply religious worldview, reflections weren't just optical phenomena. They were experiences. And when those experiences got weird, they became evidence. So if someone stared into a mirror and came away pale, sweating, or raving about visions, they weren't delusional. They were touched, maybe cursed, maybe chosen. Either way, people took it seriously. You shift in your bed. The memory of that reflective flicker from last night sticks with you. Maybe it was your imagination, or maybe the mirror saw something it wasn't supposed to. You won't be looking into it again, not tonight. The next day, the village bell tolls before sunrise, not for a feast or a market, but for a funeral. A boy drowned in the well. The locals say he was found, stiff eyes, wide skin, cold as moonlit stone. No one speaks the word curse aloud, but everyone avoids the widow's cottage on the hill. Why? Because she was seen polishing a mirror the night before outdoors, in full view of the moon. To you it might sound like coincidence. To them it's cause and effect. The mirror gleamed under the moon, and death followed. That's not a superstition, that's a pattern. You see, in the medieval mind, the connection between mirrors and death ran deep. Death wasn't just something that happened, it was often invited sometimes through the smallest gestures. And one of the strongest beliefs, that a mirror could be a door, and like all doors, if left open, something could walk through. That's why, across Europe, there was one ironclad rule after a death cover the mirrors. The moment someone died, cloth was draped over every reflective surface in the home. Sometimes black, sometimes plain linen, but always enough to obscure the glass. Why? Because people feared that the soul of the deceased, hovering between worlds, might become confused. Instead of moving on, it could see its reflection and get trapped, caught between light and shadow, forced to wander. There's a beautiful haunting superstition from the Balkans. A soul that sees itself cannot find the path. It's poetic and terrifying. Church records from 14th century England document this practice, especially among wealthier households with decorative mirrors. One entry reads, "The house of Lady Brennan was covered in cloth following the passing of her husband, lest his soul remain staring." But it didn't stop with drapes. In some villages, every mirror in town would be hidden for 3 nights after a sudden death. People feared the deceased might visit, especially if there had been unfinished business, and mirrors being light catchers could draw them in. Historians still debate whether this practice stems more from early Christian rituals surrounding the soul's journey, or if it echoes ancient pagan customs of soul reflection. Some scholars argue that the cloth over the mirror was a symbolic act of humility, turning away from self-focus in the presence of death. Others suggest it was pure folk magic. Either way, the effect was the same. Mirrors and death were inseparable, and the rules went further. You never looked into a mirror at night after a death. You never let a candle flicker too close to its surface for fear the flame might reveal a second face. And you definitely didn't try to summon the dead using a mirror. Though people tried, often in secret. A fringe practice in 15th century Bohemia involved placing a mirror near the feet of the deceased and waiting to see if a reflection appeared in the glass without the body moving. If it did, it was seen as a sign that the soul had not yet departed. If no reflection appeared at all worse, it meant the soul had been stolen, probably by a witch. In either case, everyone involved would fast for 3 days, just to be safe. Even children knew to avoid mirrors during mourning. A surviving rhyme from medieval France cautions, "Don't look long when someone's gone, or else you'll see them looking on." A joke, sure, but try saying that out loud while staring into a dark room. Fun times. And if a mirror cracked on its own during a death watch, that was a dire omen. The family would often destroy it, entirely burning the frame, burying the shards in consecrated ground, and sometimes ringing a bell over the site. Because a broken mirror was more than bad luck. It meant something else had entered, something that didn't belong. Even today, fragments of these fears linger. Funeral homes still often remove or obscure mirrors. Some cultures advise not using them for several days after a passing. You might not believe it, but the tradition lives on. Back in the medieval world, the connection between light reflection and spirit was sacred and delicate. Mirrors were thresholds, and in the hours around death, everything spiritual felt too close for comfort. So the next time you see a draped mirror in a film or walk past one at night and catch a flicker that doesn't quite match your movement, remember that 1,000 years ago, someone would have nailed shut that frame and whispered prayers through the night. And honestly, that still doesn't sound like a bad idea. You're browsing a candle stall at the market when you hear a glassy crack. A child drops a hand mirror and the entire square goes quiet. One elderly woman crosses herself. Another mutters, 7 years, if she's lucky. The child stares down, eyes wide. Her reflection is now in fragments. In your world, breaking a mirror might mean a mess and a mild superstition. In the Middle Ages, it meant something closer to doom. You didn't just break an object, you ruptured a boundary. The belief in 7 years of bad luck traces back to Roman times when it was thought that life renewed itself every 7 years. A broken mirror then disrupted the soul's reflection cycle. But by the medieval era, this idea had evolved into something darker. People believed a shattered mirror damaged not only your luck, but your spiritual alignment. A kind of psychic wound. Why so serious? Because the mirror wasn't seen as a passive object. It was active, even aware. A reflection was not just light bouncing off your face. It was your double your wraith, as some texts call it. Damaging that reflection was like wounding your shadow, and the consequences could ripple outward. In rural Germanic regions, a cracked mirror was seen as an omen of death. It didn't matter whose mirror it was. If you broke it, something in your life would soon break as well. That something could be a relationship, a body part, or if the rumors really took hold your mind. Historians still argue whether these fears were based on religious symbolism or imported superstition. Some claim the cracked mirror represented a broken link to the divine image after all humans were made in God's likeness, and a warped reflection hinted at spiritual corruption. Others argue it was about control, In an uncertain world, breaking something rare and costly was a social disaster rebranded as a mystical one. There's a quirky belief recorded in the Swiss Alps. If you broke a mirror, you could undo the curse by burying the shards in running water under a waning moon. Very specific, very muddy. But what's even more unsettling is how people treated deliberately broken mirrors. In some parts of Eastern Europe, there was a practice of shattering a mirror on purpose to trap a curse. You'd whisper your illness, your fear, your bad luck into the glass, then smash it. The idea was that the broken pieces absorbed the burden, but of course you couldn't keep them. You had to dispose of them quickly and far from home, otherwise the curse might linger, or worse, find its way back. One folktale from Poland tells of a farmer who buried a mirror under his threshold after a bad harvest. For 3 nights, they say, his goats refused to enter the barn. On the 4th, he found hoof prints on the roof and no mirror beneath the threshold. His wife never found it either, but she did find cloven prints near the well. Do with that what you will. Even homes had mirror rules. Never keep a cracked mirror, even a little chip. Never move a mirror without saying a prayer. And never sleep with broken glass in the same room. It was believed that broken reflections invited fractured dreams. You might sleep peacefully, but wake up changed. Weird side note, there's evidence that some nobles in late medieval France used intentionally cracked glass in certain rituals. They'd peer through the broken lines to see truths divided. Whether this was actual divination or just an eccentric flex of the extremely bored rich, we'll never know. But it supports the idea that mirror breaking wasn't always accidental. Sometimes people wanted to crack the veil. Of course, not everyone took these beliefs at face value. A few skeptics, mostly monks and natural philosophers, argued that a mirror was just glass and metal, that breaking one couldn't alter fate. But even those same skeptics refused to keep broken ones in their cells, just in case, they'd say. Which is perhaps the most honest medieval response to anything. So what did people do when a mirror cracked? They reacted the way we react to car alarms at night, nervous, annoyed, but unable to ignore it. The act sparked rituals, burning incense, ringing bells, sprinkling salt, and always cleansing the space with prayer or holy water. Because even if you didn't believe your neighbor did, and a bad omen ignored could spread, you shift a little now, recalling that mirror back in your room. It's intact for now. But every object has a lifespan, every frame a fault line. You wonder if it ever cracks. Will it happen by accident, or will it be something else? Something looking back, whatever the cause. You know one thing for sure, you won't be sticking around to find out. You wander into the chapel after dusk, the heavy doors groaning as you push them open. Candles line the altar, flickering nervously. But what catches your eye isn't the light, it's the silver. The gleam of chalices, crosses, and yes, the thin band of polished silver circling a small hand mirror resting beside the confessional. Why silver? To the medieval mind, silver wasn't just valuable, it was pure, holy, protective. In a world teeming with unseen threats, silver became the armor of the sacred. It was said to repel evil, reflect truth, and crucially banish illusions. That's why mirrors were often framed in it, not for decoration, but for defense. See, people didn't fear the mirror because it reflected them. They feared what might also appear. A stray face, a flicker that didn't match, a memory they hadn't summoned, and silver they believed could protect the viewer from whatever lived on the other side. You may have heard of silver bullets for werewolves. That belief traces back to older ideas that silver wounds the unnatural. If the mirror's frame was silver, then its reflection was supposed to be honest. Anything sinister wouldn't survive its glow, which makes sense unless the reflection wasn't honest to begin with. There's a curious document from a 15th century Italian apothecary that describes sacred mirrors used to diagnose possession. These mirrors, always rimmed in silver and consecrated by clergy, were held before the faces of the afflicted. If the reflection twisted, vanished, or refused to appear well, that told you something. Sometimes the mirrors cracked during these rituals. Sometimes the patients did. Historians still debate whether silver's role in mirrors was more symbolic or functional. Some suggest that since silver offered the clearest surface, when applied behind glass, it became the material of choice by necessity. Others argue that its sacred associations preceded its use in craftsmanship, that people used it because it was holy, not just handy. Either way, the result was the same silver turned a fragile object into a fortress, and not just for mirrors. In households where people feared spirits, small silver discs were hung over cribs. Travelers wore silver rings or carried silver coins with mirrored backs. Even water buckets sometimes had silver slivers hammered into their rims to ensure that reflections wouldn't lure anything in, especially during a full moon. A quirky superstition from the Pyrenees warned that if your reflection in water ever moved before you did, it meant something had taken your image, and the only way to get it back was to cast silver into the well. Sometimes people tossed in coins, other times jewelry they couldn't afford to lose. In Transylvanian villages, brides were given small silver-backed mirrors as part of their dowry, not for makeup, but for protection. The mirrors were to be placed facing the bedroom door on the wedding night, ensuring that no spirit enters uninvited. It was common to check the reflection before extinguishing the last candle. If anything seemed off, the couple was advised not to proceed. And if you're thinking this sounds like overkill, remember most people couldn't read. They didn't have Google. All they had were stories, and silver shimmered in every one of them. But silver wasn't just protection. It was weaponized truth. Mirrors rimmed with silver were sometimes brought to courtrooms. One 14th century case in Prague involved a merchant accused of theft. He swore innocence, so the magistrate produced a silver mirror. "Let the innocent see his face," he said. The merchant looked and fainted. People swore his reflection blinked after he fell. What actually happened? Maybe guilt, maybe hunger, maybe the mirror showed him something he wasn't ready to face. But from that moment on, the mirror was stored in the church, just in case. And this wasn't isolated. In parts of Brittany and Cornwall, churches kept mirror relics as part of their exorcism kits, always silver framed, always polished. One priest even claimed that a demon may hide behind the flesh, but it cannot stand its own face. A bold statement, especially when mirrors sometimes refuse to show anything at all. You glance down, now wondering what's in your reflection. You've never thought of it as a battleground, but maybe that's what it always was. Light versus shadow, soul versus trick, and silver, your only defense. Next time you pass a mirror, take a look, but not too long. Not if it isn't silvered, not if it's dusk, and definitely not if you're alone, because the thing staring back might not blink when you do. The innkeeper tells you not to worry. The mirror's harmless, he mutters, throwing a stained rag over it, unless you're foolish enough to use it after midnight. You laugh politely, but his eyes don't. You've heard the whispers how villagers dare one another to perform the midnight mirror ritual. A silly superstition maybe, but no one jokes about it more than once. The setup is always the same: a dark room, a single candle, and a mirror. Sometimes a chant is involved, sometimes just a long, silent stare. The goal: to see beyond, to glimpse your future, or your death, or the thing that wears your face but isn't you. It's called the watching. In parts of medieval Eastern Europe, this ritual was performed on All Hallows' Eve, when the boundary between the living and the dead thinned. Girls hoping to see their future husband would peer into a mirror while brushing their hair by candlelight. But sometimes they claimed it wasn't a lover. They saw it was a shadowy figure standing behind them. A dark twin, a grinning skull, a version of themselves, grinning with too many teeth. That's the thing about these rituals. They offered truth, but not the kind you could handle. A recorded case in 1423 speaks of a noble's daughter who tried the mirror rite at midnight during the harvest moon. Her maid later found her crouched in the corner, muttering, "He wouldn't go back in. He knew my name." The mirror was shattered. Her hands were bloody. She refused to ever sleep in the same room again. Historians still argue whether these rituals were born from folk traditions or later church warnings twisted into cautionary tales. Some see them as remnants of pagan divination rituals, while others suggest they served as moral deterrents, scaring young women away from vanity or romantic desire. Either way, the stories persist, and the ritual rules are consistent across regions. Never speak your name aloud. Never let the candle go out. And if the reflection moves before you do run. There's a fringe theory among mystics of the time that mirrors absorb memory, that the glass stores what it sees, and during the witching hour, it can replay that memory like a haunted echo. One record from Bohemia tells of a mirror that always showed the reflection of the man who died in front of it, even after it changed hands. A traveling friar eventually buried the mirror at a crossroads and declared the curse ended. No one dug it up to check. You think of your own mirror, now innocent, in daylight, uneasy in the dark. Could it remember the last person who stared into it too long? Would it show you or something worse? And there's another variant of the ritual, far less common, far more dangerous. Instead of one, mirror two, placed to reflect into one another endlessly, the mirror tunnel. In medieval occult circles, this was called the corridor. The idea was that each reflection peels away a layer of reality, like peeling bark from a tree. Somewhere down that tunnel, something else might be watching back, or waiting. Some claimed that placing a candle between the mirrors and staring down the infinite reflections would show the true self, but many never looked again after trying. One chilling footnote from a 15th century alchemist's journal reads the child stared too long into the corridor. She now speaks in rhymes and cannot bear her own reflection. The margin reads simply, "It looked back." There's even a quirky superstition from northern Scotland that mirrors used in rituals must be stored in linen cloth, soaked in salt water, otherwise the thing inside learns the room. Let that sit with you for a moment. You glance toward the mirror again. Covered, quiet. But you can't help but wonder what it would show if you uncovered it at exactly midnight. Would you see a Vision A face from the past, or the thing that's been dreaming you? They say if you try the mirror ritual once and walk away unscathed, you're lucky. Try it twice and you're marked. Try it 3 times, and the mirror remembers. You sleep with the shutters closed now. It's not that you believe the stories. Not really. It's just why tempt the moon. You understand now why medieval people kept it out. It wasn't about the cold. It wasn't about the dark. It was about what the moon did to your mind. The word lunacy didn't come from nowhere. In fact, during the Middle Ages, it was a medically accepted term. Physicians wrote of lunaticus, those afflicted by the moon. They cataloged symptoms, insomnia, tremors, visions, even violence. And always it spiked during a full moon. They didn't think it was just poetic. They thought it was biological. One 13th century medical manuscript from Paris instructs caretakers to tie down the afflicted on moon-fat nights. That was the phrase moon-fat, when the moon hung low and full and yellow, when it glowed like it was watching. That's when people got strange. You might laugh, but consider this: modern studies have shown slight upticks in erratic behavior around full moons. Emergency room visits, sleep disturbances, even animal aggression. Of course, science doesn't confirm causality, but medieval people didn't need data. They had lived it. They watched their neighbors howl at the sky, tear their clothes, wake up covered in mud with no memory of where they'd been. It wasn't fantasy, it was Thursday. Monasteries kept logs. Priors noted strange behavior among monks, spontaneous fasting, muttering recitation of irrelevant scripture. He refused to sleep during the bright nights. One entry reads, claimed the moon poured fire into his dreams. Historians still argue whether these were cases of undiagnosed epilepsy, bipolar disorder, or simply poor sleep hygiene. But in the medieval mindset, it was the moon meddling where it didn't belong. And it wasn't just humans. Animals changed under moonlight too. Dogs howled, horses kicked, even milk spoiled faster, according to peasant wives, who swore that moonlight curdles cream. One fringe belief held that exposing your bread dough to moonbeams would make it rise sideways, whatever that means. You start to get it. The moon wasn't gentle, it was unsettling. It took hold of the night and didn't let go. A slow, pale tide pulling at your bones, and it blurred the lines. The same moonlight that bathed saints also kissed graveyards. The same glow that guided midwives also gleamed off gallows. That ambiguity made people uneasy. In old Irish folklore, the moon was called the eye that cannot shut. It sees everything they said, even the thoughts you'd rather keep buried. If you walked beneath it with secrets, it might expose you. If you lied under it, it might whisper your sins into someone else's dream. That's why certain villages scheduled trials during new moons. Less risk of moon-muddled minds. Less chance the accused would speak in tongues or see ghosts in the crowd. There's even a quirky tale from Saxony about a man who stole silver under the full moon and was struck blind the next morning. He claimed the moon looked angry. His wife, ever helpful, sold the mirror he used to groom his beard in case it remembered. Priorities? The church got involved too. Sermons from the 14th century warned against moon rituals, lumping them in with pagan rites. Candles were fine, sunlight divine, but moonlight, that was the devil's lantern. Too cold, too curious, Yet despite the fear, the moon kept rising. And so people adapted. They blocked windows. They lit extra candles. They said prayers before bed, especially during full moons. And they kept the mirrors covered, because if you happened to wake at the wrong hour and the moonlight found your reflection, what then would it show, your face or the part of you the moon had changed? So now, as your room darkens and the shutters creak against their hinges, you find yourself checking, not for intruders, not for rats, but for light, the kind that glows a little too white, a little too still, and always finds your eyes first. There's a game children play in the village square, though they never call it a game. One stands in front of a mirror, holding a candle. The others chant from behind, face, so fine, face so fair, show us what is hiding there. The child is supposed to stare into their own eyes without blinking. If they see something move that isn't theirs, they win or they lose. It depends on who's watching. You ask around and the older folks just shake their heads. Don't mess with face thieves, one says. Once they know what you look like, they can be you. You laugh nervously, but no one else does. In medieval folklore, there are stories, strange ones, about reflections that become untethered. The concept of a face thief was common across multiple cultures, from Welsh coal towns to Slavic forests. These weren't ghosts or demons. They were imposters, beings that didn't have a form until they saw yours and then borrowed it. One German tale tells of a peddler who carried a small mirror to admire his fine mustache. One day he noticed that his reflection no longer blinked. The next morning his wife swore he had a new scar and a new accent. He denied it. Then he vanished, the mirror still sitting on their table, with two faces in it. Historians still argue whether these tales were metaphors for identity mental illness or simply boredom turned into bedtime horror. Some say the face thief was a caution against vanity. Others believe it was a way of explaining how people sometimes changed. Personality shifts, memory gaps, sleepwalking. But to the medieval mind, if someone wasn't acting like themselves, maybe they weren't. A quirky legend from the Carpathians suggests that face thieves can't mimic your voice until they've seen your reflection and heard you speak your own name. That's why many folk spells advise whispering someone else's name when passing a mirror at night. Trick the glass, they'd say. Trick the thief. And it wasn't just mirrors that posed a danger. Still water was just as risky. Lakes, ponds even polished shields. Anything that could catch your likeness could catch you. That's why in certain parts of Ireland, mirrors were never kept in a child's room. Children don't know how to protect their face. Yet said one mother, according to a surviving parish letter from 1431, too easy to take, too easy to wear. You'd hear reports from travelers about inns where no one used the mirrors, where the staff covered them with moss-green cloths and refused to explain why. In some areas, mirrors were built facing the wall, never hung. If the face doesn't see itself, it can't be taken, they'd mutter. Even nuns recorded encounters. A 14th century letter from an abbess in southern France recounts a novice who claimed her reflection was praying when she wasn't. She said it moved its lips, a beat too late, the abbess wrote. We shattered the mirror. She has since taken a vow of silence. It's not that these stories were everywhere, but where they did appear, they stuck. Because who hasn't caught their own face looking wrong in poor light, who hasn't stared too long and started to feel, other modern psychologists might call it the strange face illusion, a phenomenon where prolonged gazing into a mirror can distort one's reflection. Your brain starts losing track of details. Faces melt, shift, warp. But in the Middle Ages, they didn't have neuroscience. They had stories. And when your reflection changed, it wasn't your brain glitching, it was your soul slipping. You sit quietly now, candle flickering, the mirror still covered across the room, and you wonder, if you were to look, really look, what would you see yourself? Or the thing that's been watching you through the glass all along? The bell tolls again. Another death. This time, not a villager, but a foreigner. A merchant from far away who'd rented the top floor room of the inn. No one saw it happen. No wound, no struggle. Just a cold body curled by the hearth and a mirror cracked in the middle laid gently across his chest. You don't ask questions, neither does anyone else. Instead, the innkeeper covers the mirror with a shroud and recites a prayer under his breath. It's something about keeping the window shut. It's not superstition, he says. It's respect. Because in the medieval world, when death entered a room, so did its shadow. And mirrors were how that shadow found its way in. There was a common belief throughout Europe that the soul lingered after death, uncertain, confused, hovering, especially if the death was sudden or violent. Mirrors as reflective thresholds could trap the soul, hold it in place like amber. That's why they were covered. You already know this. But what you might not know is what happened if someone forgot. A 14th century diary from a Flemish priest recounts how a family left a mirror uncovered after a child died of fever. For 3 nights, the mother claimed she saw the child's face appear in it, smiling, crying, then melting away. She begged the priest to burn the mirror. He did. But the next night, she saw the reflection in a bucket of water. The priest later wrote, "We removed all shine from the home. Let the dark be kind." In parts of Romania, there was a custom of smashing mirrors before a funeral procession passed. The idea was that the dead might glance sideways and get caught like a fish in glass. You wanted their journey clean, uninterrupted. No backward glances. Historians still debate the origin of this fear. Some trace it back to pre-Christian burial rites that associated reflective surfaces with the other side. Others believe it's a psychological reflex, grief, magnifying guilt, which finds its way into whatever medium is nearby. Still, the evidence is scattered everywhere. French peasants placing mirrors face down beneath the bed. Scandinavian sailors refusing to carry mirrors at sea in case they drowned and their spirit couldn't leave the boat. Even some medieval hospitals removed mirrors from patients' rooms, not for infection control, but to clear the light, as one monk put it. And here's a strange one. In a 1397 account from northern Italy, a widow insisted that her husband's ghost had become trapped in their bedroom mirror. Every night she claimed she could hear him knocking from the inside. They covered the mirror in thick cloth, nailed it shut inside a wooden box, and buried it with his favorite boots. Problem solved. Until her daughter found a shard in the hearth and claimed it whispered her name. Quirky, sure, but believable. Ask someone who's heard it happen. There were even reports of mirror hauntings rooms, where mirrors supposedly retained the essence of a dying scream or a final breath. Landlords wouldn't rent such rooms unless the mirror was replaced. Sometimes they weren't. People just stopped using that corner. In the English countryside, folk tradition held that a covered mirror was a respectful silence. Uncover it too soon, and you spoke over the dead. You called them back, and they might answer. That's why during mourning, it wasn't just the mirror that changed. It was the behavior around it. People avoided their own reflections. They lowered their voices. They lit candles at angles that didn't cast back. Because even if you didn't believe, well, you didn't want to invite anything. One open scholarly debate lingers around this practice. Did people fear the mirror would capture the soul or reveal it? Was it a trap or a window into the beyond? Either way, the rule was simple. After death, mirrors must be treated with reverence. The glass remembers, the glass can call. And if you happen to look into one too soon, after someone's passing, you may not see your own reflection. You may see theirs, looking right back. You're out near the fields helping stack bundles of barley when someone mutters, "Don't let the moon see it." You pause. The what? The harvest. The old man says, squinting skyward, "It'll sour the grain if the moon watches it too long." He's already tossing a burlap cloth over the bundle, and just like that, the moon is once again suspect. It wasn't enough to worry about it sneaking into your dreams or bending your reflection. Medieval folk also believed that moonlight could corrupt the land, wilt crops, rot milk, spoil meat, cause animals to go stillborn. No proof required just decades of pattern and whispers. You probably assume moonlight is just reflected sunlight, right? Science agrees. But in the Middle Ages, that wasn't settled knowledge. To them, the moon's glow was different, pale, unnatural, cold light, not warm. It was seen as active, not passive, a force, not a mirror. One preserved tract from a 13th century French herbalist describes moonlight as a thin silver poison and warns that storing herbs under its gaze can drain their heat and turn blessing to bitterness. That same text recommends drying leaves in dark attics or earthen jars not for humidity, but to hide them from the moon. And it didn't stop with herbs. Across England and Germany, it was widely believed that moonlight could spoil dairy. Milk left out too long at night was said to curdle prematurely or become tainted. Wives in farming villages took great care to keep pails lidded after sunset. Butter churned by moonlight said to cause night cramps if eaten. Cheese cut under a full moon blamed for bad dreams. One quirky folk remedy from the Swiss Alps even advised placing a piece of raw iron beside your cheese wheel if it had been exposed to moonlight to draw out the cold. It's basically the medieval version of slapping a magnet on your fridge and calling it science. Farmers had moon calendars, not just for planting, but for protecting. Crops were covered wine barrels, sealed even beehives draped with cloth. Why? Because it was said that the moon invites worms. Grain sprouted strangely honey, turned thin, and people blamed the night sky. Historians still argue whether these beliefs arose from natural coincidences, like sudden dew mold or fungal blooms, or from symbolic fears. After all, the moon ruled over tides, and by extension, blood and birth and madness. Why wouldn't it tamper with your harvest too? Even religion got tangled in this logic. Monastic almanacs marked dangerous moon phases for gathering communion wine or preserving relics. A few even postponed baptisms if the moon was too round. One priest in Yorkshire refused to bless bread baked under full moons, writing the host must rise under the eye of the Lord, not the lesser light. It wasn't all doom and gloom, though. Some saw the moon as a trickster, not a villain. In parts of Scandinavia, People told stories of the moon playing jokes on the earth, rearranging chickens, souring cream, or making people misplace their boots. No explanation needed. Just, it was the moon again. There's even a playful rhyme from Wales. If your broth won't boil, blame the silver oil. Moonlight in the pot turns it cold when it's hot. Even children said it, and stopped stirring after dark. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some natural philosophers argued that moonlight was harmless, and that coldness of the night was to blame. But when their barns started growing blue mold, guess who everyone sided with, and there were stranger tales. A farmhand in Bohemia claimed he saw a woman standing in his field under the full moon staring into the barley. She didn't move when he called. She didn't move at all. When he approached, she vanished, but the next morning the grain was blackened in a perfect circle where she had stood. Was it mold, a prank, bad fertilizer, or was it the moon? Choosing a spot to mark whatever the truth, precautions became routine. You didn't leave food in the open at night. You didn't work under full moons. And if something spoiled suddenly grain milk meat, you never blamed luck. You looked up, and the moon looked back. You find yourself drawn to a strange little book in the apothecary's shop, bound in cracked leather pages, stiff with age. Inside, sketches of moon's mirrors, symbols you don't recognize, and a single chilling phrase scrawled across the title page. To catch the light is to tempt the dark. It's not a religious text. Not exactly. It's alchemy. The medieval world wasn't just afraid of the moon and mirrors, they studied them obsessively. Alchemists and natural philosophers believed that light itself held secrets, and if sunlight could nurture life, then maybe moonlight could unlock other kinds of power, stranger kinds. You see, alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was about understanding the universe's hidden layers, transformation essence, and reflection. And what reflected better than a mirror? That's why early alchemists were fascinated by mirrored surfaces. They polished copper and obsidian, then later silvered glass not for vanity but for rituals. Some believed that by angling a mirror correctly during certain moon phases, they could concentrate the moon's energy into a vessel like boiling the night. One text from 14th century Prague details an experiment in which a mirror was placed inside a ring of salt beneath a skylight on the night of a waxing gibbous. The goal: capture a beam of moonlight and distill it onto a strip of parchment. The result: the writing glowed, it rids but only until cockcrow. The glow vanished with the sun. Quirky, yes. But this wasn't isolated. In Alexandria's translated scrolls, medieval scholars found records of ancient Egyptian rituals involving moon ink made with silver honey and ground pearls believed to reveal hidden truths only under moonlight. European alchemists tried recreating it, usually with mercury and crushed glass. Results varied and sometimes exploded. Historians still argue whether these efforts were purely symbolic attempts to manifest spiritual insight or if they represented a misunderstood form of chemistry. Either way, they show how deeply the moon's influence was believed to seep into everything, even ink, even ideas. And then there's the mirror box. In 15th century Spain, a group of mystics created a series of mirrored containers meant to trap unseen rays. These devices had no lenses, just angled glass and metal polished to an extreme sheen. They were left outside during eclipses and blood moons. The goal: to catch the dark light. One surviving record claims that a mirror box cracked in the apothecary's hands after an eclipse. He reportedly fell into a fever of confusion and tried to drink lamp oil thinking it was wine. He recovered, the box didn't. Others claimed success. One German text boasts that a moon-distilled tincture cured insomnia. The patient sleeps like stone, it says proudly, and dreams of black rivers. Comforting. Of course, the church had opinions. Many of these practices were condemned, though not always banned outright. It depended on whether the alchemist used mirrors for lightwork healing, purification, revelation, or shadowcraft divination, communication with spirits unlocking forbidden knowledge. One friar described a practitioner who tried to reflect moonlight through a silver disc onto a crucifix to cleanse the sins of the image. He was excommunicated for idolatry. Apparently, mirrors didn't get to be priests, and yet alchemists persisted. They believed that moonlight, being softer and slower than sunlight, revealed the truths that the day would hide. A person who studied the moon's glow through mirrors might see themselves as they truly were, soul-stripped, bare motives exposed. The glass didn't lie, they said, but neither did it comfort. A fringe belief developed that mirrors used too often under the moon would remember you, that each time you returned to it, it showed less of your outer self and more of your hidden one. Until the face is no longer yours, one account says, but the thing you carry inside. And what happens when that face learns how to look back? You close the book, gently slide it back on the shelf. The apothecary doesn't charge you for browsing. He simply nods and says, "Best not try those. The light's too clever these days." And you wonder not for the first time whether it's curiosity or the mirror that's staring harder. It starts as a whisper, really. You're walking past the old hospital, half-abandoned windows bricked up when you hear it. A soft rustle, not leaves, not rats, something else. And then a faint voice, "Don't look at the glass." You glance up. One of the few remaining panes reflects the setting sun. Just for a moment, you think you see a figure in the window, but the floor it's on was sealed years ago. You keep walking. Back in the Middle Ages, asylums weren't the cold institutional spaces we imagine today. They were monasteries, workhouses, converted manors where those considered touched or possessed were hidden away from polite society. And in almost all of them, mirrors were banned, not for safety, for silence. There was a common belief that madness fed on reflection, that the more a person stared into a mirror, the more they became what the mirror showed. It wasn't a case of seeing something disturbing. It was becoming unmoored, disconnected, no longer rooted in their own body. One 14th century physician from Milan wrote that certain patients spoke more clearly when the mirrors were removed, as if their confusion had been borrowed. Another insisted that mirrors aggravate the humors of the melancholic, a phrase that today might translate to, "This thing makes people worse." Historians still argue whether mirror removal was a form of therapeutic superstition or an early psychological insight. Perhaps mirrors did distress the already distressed, especially those suffering from hallucinations, dissociation, or trauma. But in the Middle Ages, this became doctrine: no reflections in places of madness. There's a curious account from Avignon of a patient who claimed his reflection tried to strangle him in the water basin. He refused to drink for 3 days. They removed all polished surfaces from his cell. He drank again, but never looked at his own hands. A fringe belief held that mirrors could split a person's soul if stared into too long under the wrong conditions, namely during fevers, bleeding rituals, or under moonlight. Any one of these could soften the soul, making it pliable. If a reflection caught it during that state, it might not return, or return twisted. And what about people who refused to be reflected at all? There are scattered records of individuals who covered every mirror they encountered, wore hoods refused to wash with water if it reflected the sky. One monk wrote, "He walks with the shadows, for he believes his face is not his own." The diagnosis, lunar infection. The treatment, isolation. No mirrors, no windows, and only speaking when the moon was dark. Quirky detail. In some remote abbeys, there were mirror hours, strictly limited times when monks were allowed to use reflective surfaces, usually small polished bowls. Mirrors were kept in locked drawers. The idea was to prevent identity drift, a term not used then, but clearly understood. There was also fear that mirrors could capture a person's madness and reflect it outward. A tale from a northern English convent tells of a nun who became violently agitated. After she passed her mirror, previously used only to pin, her veil was said to shimmer, even in darkness. The abbess ordered it shattered. The shards were buried beneath a weeping willow, as if that would soak the grief from the glass. And if you think this is all metaphor, consider this: modern studies confirm that excessive mirror use can exacerbate symptoms of psychosis and body dysmorphia. What the medieval mind described as reflection sickness, we now frame in clinical terms. Still, something remains unsettling, especially when stories persist of people going silent after catching sight of themselves, as if the reflection said something they couldn't forget, or maybe took something. A famous 15th century case involved a physician who placed mirrors in an asylum for observation. He noted a pattern: some patients smiled at themselves, others wept, but a few simply stared and didn't stop. One woman stared for 9 hours. When the mirror was removed, she had forgotten her name, but could recall the names of 3 others in the ward. No one knew how she'd learned them. She died the next week, the mirror still intact. So yes, mirrors were banned, but sometimes they were hidden, stored under floorboards, slipped behind icons, because curiosity doesn't vanish even behind barred windows. And if a patient begged to see themselves, well, what harm could one glance do? Unless, of course, they didn't recognize the face staring back, or worse, recognized it all too well. The candlelight dances against the wall as you lower your eyes to a narrow strip of polished brass. You're told it's not a mirror, just a grooming plate, they say. But when your gaze meets your own, something tightens in your chest. Not fear, not awe, just a low thrum of guilt somehow. Or is it shame? It's subtle but unmistakable. And in the Middle Ages, that feeling had a name: vanity. Vanity wasn't a personality trait back then. It was a sin, and a dangerous one. More than pride, more than greed. Because vanity meant turning your eyes from God and toward yourself. Looking at your own reflection too long was not just indulgent, it was spiritually risky. That's why mirrors weren't found in every home. Even among the wealthy, they were used sparingly, often tucked away, hidden behind drapes or cabinets. You didn't casually glance at yourself. You checked your soul when you did. The church warned against the sin of Narcissus, not the mythological figure directly, but the idea of him, the person who fell in love with their reflection and drowned. In sermons, priests adapted it to warn against mirrors of the flesh, a poetic way of saying, Stop obsessing over your face, it'll drag you down. And if you think that's dramatic, consider this: some convents banned mirrors outright. Not only were they linked to vanity, but also to temptation. Seeing one's own beauty or imagining it was believed to stir lustful thoughts, even in solitude. A moment's reflection could become an invitation to sin. Historians still argue whether this was about moral control or fear of female agency. Because let's be honest, most mirror-related warnings were directed at women. Paintings of the era often depict female figures holding mirrors while demons leer nearby. The implication to admire yourself is to draw the devil closer. A quirky detail from a 14th century Venetian etiquette guide: brides were advised to avoid mirrors on their wedding night so as not to awaken pride, for humility is the bed of blessing. It goes on to recommend the groom compliment the bride only by candlelight and after prayer. Romance, medieval style. In many noble houses, mirrors were reserved for moments of public preparation before a feast before court. Never in private chambers, and never ever under moonlight. Why? Because combining reflection and moonlight was thought to encourage delusion. The sin of vanity twisted into madness. Even makeup was suspect, not just because of what it was made from lead mercury crushed bugs, but because applying it required a mirror. And if a woman spent too much time with either, tongues wagged. In England, a bishop once wrote that mirrors breed pride, and pride invites the whisper of Satan. Strong words, considering he probably checked his hat before sermons. But not all reflections were scorned. Holy mirrors existed too. Saint Clare of Assisi was called the Mirror of Christ, a title meant to reflect her piety and spiritual purity. In mystical texts, mirrors symbolized the soul clear when sinless, clouded by transgression. Some monks even kept obsidian discs, not to view themselves, but to meditate on the dark. A mirror not of appearance, but of nothingness. The goal, ego death. Still, the fear lingered, that looking too deeply into your own eyes might summon something from beneath. Not a ghost, not a demon, just you revealed, and maybe you weren't ready for that. The story goes that a scholar in Ghent grew obsessed with studying his own reflection by different candlelight, first white tallow, then beeswax, then lamb fat dipped in herbs. He kept notes. He claimed his features changed with each type of flame, more youthful, more aged, once non-human. His journals end abruptly with, "I must look no more, it knows me now." Whether that's fact or fantasy, you'll never know. But tonight, as you glance toward your reflection in the brass plate, lit only by the smallest of flames, you can't help but ask, is this really you? Or the part of you the world warns against, the part that knows you better than any priest? The fire has died low, but sleep won't come. You rise restless and drift outside. The air is cool damp with the breath of distant fields. Crickets trill, owls whisper. But all you notice is the moon. It hangs low, huge, bright enough to cast shadows behind you. You feel watched, and suddenly you remember the old warning: unmarried women must not bathe in moonlight alone. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like a passage from a forgotten fairy tale. But in the Middle Ages it was said with grave concern. Moonlight wasn't just light. It was influence. It seeped into skin, whispered to blood-bent fate, especially for women. In many parts of medieval Europe, girls were taught from a young age to avoid lingering in moonlight. It was believed to stir the humors, especially melancholy, and affect a woman's temperament. Too much moon, they said, and you'd become strange, too quiet, too dreamy, too difficult to marry. The moon was linked to cycles, of course. Everyone knew that. The monthly rhythm of the female body mirrored the lunar calendar too closely to ignore. But rather than celebrate it, medieval society twisted it into suspicion. If a girl seemed too independent, too willful, too clever, it was whispered that she must have mooned too long, that the light had made her wild. Historians still argue whether this belief was rooted in medical superstition or social control. Likely both. Medieval physicians blamed the moon for uterine wanderings, the idea that a woman's womb could literally move inside her body, causing hysteria visions or mood swings, all of which naturally could be fixed by marriage and obedience. But some women leaned into the moon's power. In folk circles, it was said that bathing in moonlight could bring beauty, or visions, or lovers. That's where the superstition turns murky because moon rituals weren't always forbidden. They were just secret. A woman might leave her hair down under the full moon and brush it 100 times to attract a suitor. Or she might whisper the name of the one she loved 3 times while turning slowly in a circle, allowing the moonlight to stitch his image into her dreams. One fringe tradition in southern France spoke of the moon-drunk girl, a girl who spent too many nights wandering the fields under a full moon. They said she would glow faintly in the dark, that her eyes became silvery, and that no man could lie to her afterward. A blessing. A curse? Depends on who you asked. A quirky belief from Bohemia warned that moonlight could etch a person's desires into their bones if they were left too long beneath it while thinking impure thoughts. What you think in the glow you wear in the marrow, one line says. No one explains how, but it kept people inside. And the danger wasn't just to virtue or marriage prospects. There were tales of women lost to the moon. One story tells of a girl who danced under it every night, spinning in silence until her feet bled. When they tried to stop her, she screamed and vanished into the woods. They say she still walks on clouded nights, eyes white skin luminous. A bride of the moon. A warning. Church elders condemned such stories as pagan relics. They instructed confessors to ask about night-wandering dreams of silver and unseemly fascination with reflection, especially in unmarried women, especially during moon weeks. Mirrors were discouraged during those times too. The moon outside the mirror within it was too much, a double invitation. You weren't supposed to see yourself under the moon. That was when your image could break free. Some girls dared to try anyway, sneaking out with small polished discs, asking the moon to show them their fates, their husbands, their future children. Some claimed success. Others didn't speak of what they saw. You stand now in the pale hush of night, your feet damp with dew. The moon spills over you like a cold blanket. You don't feel afraid. Not exactly, but there is a sense of being open, of something noticing. You remember the rhyme, barefoot girl the moon will find, a mirror soul, and take her mind. You step back under the eaves, just in case, because even if you don't believe it, the moon might. You're watching a group of children chase each other down the lane, their laughter sharp against the quiet dusk. One stumbles, then gasps not from pain but from fear. She looked at me. The child cries, pointing at a cracked bit of mirror nailed to the doorpost. You glance at it, just a sliver weather-worn and dull, but it still catches the light and the eyes. This wasn't unusual. In medieval Europe, many doorways bore small shards of mirror or polished metal, not for decoration, but for defense. Because the greatest fear wasn't the stranger on the road, it was the gaze, more specifically, the evil eye. This ancient superstition, rooted in Roman, Greek, and Middle Eastern traditions, survived and thrived through the Middle Ages. The idea was simple, but terrifying. Some people knowingly or not could curse others simply by looking at them. Jealousy, anger, or malice behind the eyes could twist fate, cause illness, wilt crops, steal sleep, even warp a baby's limbs, and the cure reflected light, a mirror on your door, a polished brooch on your chest, a basin of water in your window, not to admire yourself, but to send the gaze back. Historians still debate whether mirrors were seen as shields or weapons in this belief system. Some texts suggest they bounced the evil eye away. Others claim they caught it, held it, so it couldn't enter. Either way, if someone gave you a look that chilled your bones, your first move might be to find a mirror and check your reflection. If it looked off, you were marked. One 14th century Scottish folktale tells of a girl whose left eye turned milky after receiving a look from a traveling peddler. Her mother held a mirror to her face and saw not her daughter's reflection, but two. The second one blinked wrong, she said. They buried the mirror in salt. It wasn't just for curses. Reflections were thought to reveal intention. You might hold a mirror up to a baby to see if they cried or cooed. A coo meant peace. A cry, someone had looked at them wrong, and you'd need to act fast, burn. Rosemary turned the child 3 times and let moonlight cleanse the face just enough to soften the mark. A quirky belief from southern Italy held that only glass could reflect the evil eye without absorbing it. That's why some mirrors were made with obsidian or polished metal, instead less risk of retaining the glance. Others believed the opposite, that glass was too weak to resist the curse and only silver could contain it. Either way, you didn't look into a mirror after receiving the evil eye, not unless you wanted to see the curse staring back. And don't forget, most mirrors could also cause the evil eye if used improperly. In some villages, it was considered dangerously arrogant to carry a mirror in public. A woman who admired herself openly, especially under sunlight, might gather looks which could combine into a curse. One account from Burgundy claims that a girl collapsed after preening too long before market day. She whispered, "They saw me before fainting." Her mirror was thrown into a stream. The stream dried up that summer. In religious circles, the evil eye became a theological debate. Could intention truly carry weight? Could the devil act through sight alone? Some priests said yes, and encouraged the use of sacred symbols etched into mirrors, crosses, saints, or single Latin letters, like V's for virtue's virtue, just enough to block the beam. You begin to notice how many buildings around the village have small reflective objects nailed above thresholds, spoons, burnished coins, even bits of broken plate. They're not forgotten trash. They're wards. They remind you that in this world, reflection is a double-edged sword, a thing that reveals and repels. And you think of your own reflection now, safe, untouched, you hope. But the question lingers. What if someone did look at you, malicious, envious, cruel? Would you know? Would your mirror? Would it show? Or would it stare back altered? Not you anymore, but something wearing your face. The fire crackles low as the children sleep, their breath steady and soft, but the mother doesn't rest. She sits upright by the hearth, watching the wall where the mirror used to hang. She took it down days ago, not broken, not cursed, just unsettling, because her daughter whispered something before falling ill. I saw someone else in it. They blinked too soon. In medieval households, nighttime reflections were deeply distrusted, especially for children, even more so after dark, and not just because of the moon. There was a widespread belief that the veil between worlds thinned during the night. Sleep was a vulnerable state. The soul, they said, wandered while the body rested, and a mirror left uncovered could act as a gate inviting something else in while your spirit was out. This belief was so common that some towns had curfews not just for people, but for mirrors. A cloth over the glass. A blessing whispered as the shutters were drawn. Even wealthy families, with ornate silver-framed mirrors, had designated servants whose nightly job was to cover them before sundown. They weren't called servants. They were called keepers. Historians still debate whether this tradition arose out of religious teachings or folk memory. Some link it to ancient Roman beliefs that the soul could become lost if it saw itself in a reflective surface at the wrong moment. Others point to Christian fears that demons used mirrors as portals, especially during sleep when defenses were down. There's a chilling story from 15th century Bavaria. A boy slept beneath a wall mirror during a particularly stormy night. When his parents checked on him, he was gone. No signs of escape, no window open, just an imprint on the pillow and a handprint on the inside of the mirror. They buried it in the woods. Some say you can still see the boy's face if you shine moonlight through the trees on the right night. A fringe belief mostly whispered among midwives claimed that a child's reflection could be stolen before speech. Until they spoke their name, their soul wasn't fully anchored. That's why infants were rarely shown mirrors, or even still water. A quirky English folk rhyme went, "Don't show baby the glass at night, or he'll see eyes that steal his sight." Parents believed that showing a baby its reflection in moonlight could lead to mirror silence, a condition where the child refused to speak. We'd now call it trauma or developmental delay. But to them, it was the mirror's fault. Even among adults, nighttime reflection had rules. You didn't look into the mirror while brushing your hair. You didn't light a candle and glance in while preparing for bed. If you caught your own eyes in the glass by accident, you turned 3 times counterclockwise to unwind the thread. And most importantly, you never looked in if you'd had a nightmare. Why? Because it was believed that dreams left a residue and the mirror might pick it up, reflect it, replay it, or worse, make it real. One story from rural Wales tells of a woman who dreamt of drowning, only to awaken and see her reflection dripping wet. She screamed. The mirror cracked. She never entered that room again. Monasteries had their own version of this. Mirrors were kept covered in dormitories. Only the abbot had the key to a small hand mirror, used sparingly and never at night. A monk once broke this rule out of vanity. He later confessed that his reflection had lingered too long. His vow of silence followed the next day. There's also the strange phenomenon of reflections moving independently. Stories abound of people seeing themselves walk away, blink late, or whisper silently through the glass. Was it madness, pareidolia, or did medieval folks experience something we can't explain? Even skeptics had their doubts. A 15th century physician, skeptical of mirror fears, conducted a test by sleeping in a room filled with uncovered mirrors during a full moon. His letters grow erratic after the third night. The last entry simply reads, "They are not mimics, they are studying." What they meant remains unclear. You glance at the mirror across the room now, covered, of course, but you remember the nights you didn't bother. The quick glance after brushing your teeth, the double take when the light flickered oddly, and you ask yourself if only once, was the reflection always yours, or just something waiting for the right moment? Maybe it still is. A red glow seeps into your room, soft but unmistakable. You pull the curtain back. The moon is bleeding. At least that's what it looks like. A blood moon, rusted and eerie, looming low over the rooftops. Even in your time, it's unnerving. But in the Middle Ages, it was a cosmic warning. To medieval eyes, the blood moon wasn't just a natural eclipse. It was a punishment, or a promise of one to come. When the moon turned red, something was already wrong, or about to go very, very wrong. You've probably read that a blood moon occurs when the earth passes between the sun and moon, casting a reddish shadow due to atmospheric dust and refraction. Medieval folk had no such comfort. All they saw was the moon, normally pale and watchful, now flushed with something like anger. And they noticed the timing. Plagues, famines, sudden deaths, betrayals. Every time something truly horrible happened, someone somewhere remembered a red moon in the sky the night before. And soon enough the pattern solidified. If the moon bleeds, so will the world. One preserved chronicle from a monastery in northern Italy records the moon darkened and wet blood above the steeple. 3 days later, Brother Anselm died without last rites. His eyes were open still. That image alone was enough to ensure no monk would ever forget it. Historians still argue whether these connections were post hoc panic or genuine superstitions rooted in early astronomy. Some believe the red moon was feared because it mirrored the color of human vulnerability, blood flame rust sickness. Others suggest it tapped into the primal fear of unnatural change. The moon wasn't supposed to do that. And what of the mirrors during a blood moon that was a whole other terror? It was widely believed that reflections during a lunar eclipse, where tainted mirrors became windows for the wrong kind of light. People who looked into a mirror during a blood moon were said to risk seeing their final moment, or worse, someone else's. One tale from a Bohemian village tells of a man who gazed into a basin of water during the eclipse and saw himself on fire. The next week, his cottage burned to the ground. He survived but never touched water again without muttering a prayer. There was a curious practice in Hungary of burying all reflective objects before a blood moon. This included mirrors, glass-polished metal, anything that might catch the sky's tears. It was said that a reflection during this time wasn't yours, but the moon's. And the moon never forgot a face it saw while bleeding. A quirky superstition from Brittany claimed that if you accidentally saw your reflection during a blood moon, you had to trick it back. You'd light 3 candles in a triangle, say your name backward, and then spit on the mirror. If the reflection didn't blink, you were safe. If it did run, said the old women, don't ask, just run. There were even reports of mirrors shattering spontaneously during red moons. Whether from cold tension or imagination, the result was the same. A cracked mirror during an eclipse meant something had tried to enter and failed, but not without leaving a mark. In religious circles, the blood moon was folded into end-time prophecies. Some believed it signaled divine wrath. Others thought it marked the moment when the veil between realms thinned to its weakest. That's why certain cults, tucked into shadowy corners of the medieval world, sought out blood moons. They believed it was the only time they could see truly. These groups performed mirror rites at midnight, aligning glass and obsidian in strange shapes, whispering ancient names. Many didn't speak again. A few vanished. One group in southern Spain wrote a final note. The light turned its head. We looked back. It saw. You close the curtain now. The moon still burns red behind it. You can't shake the feeling that it knows something, that it's seen too much. And though your mirror is turned to the wall, you wonder if you glanced at it now, just once, what would you see? A flash of the future, a forgotten face, or something already inside the room. You enter the small chapel at dawn expecting silence. Instead, you find the mirrors covered. Not surprising, but strange, because this chapel doesn't usually have mirrors at all. Yet here they are, 3 of them wrapped in white cloth and hung high like paintings. No one looks at them. No one speaks of them. In medieval churches, mirrors were not welcome, not just because of vanity, but because reflection had no place in the house of God. Only submission did. Mirrors invited self-examination. But the church preferred confession. You didn't look inward with glass, you looked upward with prayer. To place a mirror inside a sacred space was seen by many as arrogant, distracting, even dangerous. The most devout churches and monasteries kept their walls deliberately unreflective. No polished brass, no silver ornaments without patina. Even the chalices were often dulled with use, not because they didn't care, but because they did. The idea was this: in the presence of the divine, your reflection should disappear. You weren't supposed to focus on yourself. You were supposed to fade. One 12th century bishop wrote, "Let not the seeker gaze upon himself in the Lord's house, lest he mistake his soul for his shape," which granted sounds like poetry, but also a warning. Historians still debate the intent. Was this about humility control, or a deeper belief that mirrors might interfere with divine perception? Some texts describe mirrors as duplicative light, meaning they create a false version of the world. In a sacred space, where truth was meant to shine, this duplicity had no place. But then why do some churches include mirrors? Because not all reflection was condemned. There were rare but real holy mirrors, artifacts used during exorcisms or rites of penance. These were not for gazing, they were for revealing. A sinner might be asked to glance into a consecrated mirror to see whether the devil resided near the eye. This practice, often done in dim light, was thought to show a flicker, a shimmer, a sign of corruption. Some priests carried pocket mirrors, not for grooming, but for spiritual tests. One surviving account from Bavaria tells of a dying man who was shown a small round mirror on his deathbed. He wept when he saw his own face, the priest wrote, for it was not his own. We said the prayers twice. A quirky tradition from northern France involved angel mirrors, tiny discs of silver placed beside a newborn's crib to reflect the soul of the guardian spirit. But these were removed before the child could speak, for fear that the spirit might instead mirror the child and confuse its soul. And of course, reflections near altars were avoided entirely. There's a reason stained glass was preferred to clear windows. Color, abstraction, a story told through light, not a self reflected by it. A monk once wrote, "We see ourselves too much. Better to see the saints." Still, there are scattered stories of churches that broke these rules. In one English abbey, a full-length mirror was installed in the nave as part of a new architectural experiment. The goal, to reflect the heavens, they said. It was removed within a week. A novice claimed he saw something behind him that no one else could. Another said his own reflection smiled with different teeth. The mirror was shattered, the shards buried beneath the baptismal font. And then there's the covered mirrors you now see. They might be old protection. Mirrors used during a plague to detect signs of sickness, pale lips, sweat vacant eyes, then covered for fear of what they'd caught. Or they might be part of a ritual you're not meant to know. Because the church didn't always destroy mirrors. Sometimes it kept them tucked away, bound in cloth, blessed with oil and silence, as if to say this object is dangerous, but not useless. It just depends who's holding it. You leave the chapel now, heart a little heavier, because behind every covered mirror is a question: what did it see? And more importantly, what saw it back? It's well past midnight when you hear the door bolt slide shut. Not yours, your neighbor's, and then another, then another. You peek through the shutters and see them, your fellow villagers, locking their doors, drawing thick curtains, covering windows with boards. One woman even places an iron key under her child's pillow. Tonight isn't a holiday. It's a full moon. And in the Middle Ages, that meant one thing: sleepwalking. You might laugh now. Sleepwalking. That strange, almost comic phenomenon where someone rises in the night to raid the pantry or rearrange the shoes. Not then. Noctambulation, they called it. Moonwalking. And they did not see it as benign. They saw it as possession. It wasn't uncommon for people to wake and find themselves in a different room or outside barefooted in the cold, unaware of how they got there. Sometimes they were unharmed, sometimes not. And when these strange episodes coincided with the full moon, the conclusion was obvious: the moon was leading them. One 14th century medical text claims that the moon calls the soul away during sleep. The idea was that the light falling through shutters or across a pillow could awaken not the body, but the inner self. The part that dreams, the part that remembers, and sometimes the part that wanders. There are dozens of folk tales about people who vanished under the moon, men who woke up by rivers they didn't remember walking to, children who were found curled in strange places beneath trees inside barns, once even atop a chapel roof. They weren't seen as dreamers, they were seen as touched. Historians still argue whether the link between the moon and sleepwalking was superstition or a rudimentary attempt at pattern recognition. Some say it was hormonal cycles, others believe it was just fear of losing control. But the belief was strong enough to shape behavior. Doors were locked from the inside. Mirrors were turned to the wall. Candles were left lit not for light, but for witness. Because another fear ran deeper, not that you might walk in your sleep, but that something else might walk in your place. You see, in some regions, it was believed that sleepwalkers weren't just wandering. They were being guided, pulled like marionettes by the moon's glow, and sometimes a reflection was blamed. There's a haunting little tale from an alpine village. A young woman was known to sleepwalk during full moons. She was sweet, quiet, pious. But one night her brother followed her and watched her stand in front of the mirror for an hour. not moving, not speaking, just staring. The next morning, she couldn't remember the mirror at all. 2 weeks later, she was found in the woods wondering that she was trying to return the face. One fringe belief held that mirrors amplify lunar pull. If a mirror catches moonlight at the moment your eyes flutter beneath your lids, it can create a loop, a moment where your spirit, your image, and the moon all align. And in that alignment, something ancient notices. That's why reflective surfaces were removed from bedrooms, not for modesty but for protection. A mirror near the bed might not just reflect you, it might pull you out. A quirky superstition from rural Wales said that if a person sleepwalked into a mirror and the reflection didn't crack, they'd never wake up the same. Some were said to speak other languages. Others claimed not to recognize their own homes. And if you encountered a sleepwalker, there were rules. Never wake them. Never speak their name. Never under any circumstance let them see their reflection. Because if they did, it might be their reflection that woke up. A priest in Normandy kept a log of moon nights. He noted who sleepwalked, who muttered, who stood staring at walls. He burned incense before each full moon and placed bowls of water in doorways, not to cleanse but to reflect. He believed that if a spirit tried to enter, it would pause at its own image and be confused, delayed just long enough for dawn to break. You close your own door now, slowly. Outside, the moon is full and cold and unspeakably bright. It presses against the shutters, like a whisper you almost hear. You think of your dreams, how vivid they've become lately, how sometimes you wake up facing the mirror, even though you went to bed turned away. You wonder, is it just a dream, or is the moon calling something that looks like you? The village midwife leans forward, eyes glassy in the firelight. You think a mirror just shows your face, she says, voice barely above a whisper. No, it shows your soul, and some of us don't want to know what that looks like. You nod politely, but you don't disagree. In the Middle Ages, there was a persistent belief that a mirror didn't merely reflect the surface, it could trap what lay beneath. Not just a curse, not just a reflection, a soul. This wasn't symbolic, it was literal. When you looked into a mirror, you risked leaving something behind, especially if you lingered, especially if you stared at your own eyes. The longer the gaze, the deeper the pull. It's why mirrors were covered after death, yet but also during illness, childbirth, or grief. Because those were moments when the soul was loose vulnerable, half in and half out. And if a mirror caught it, it might never give it back. A 15th century physician in Florence wrote that a man under fever shall not look upon glass, else his humors forget their form and flee from his skin. That's a poetic way of saying, don't let the sick see themselves, or they might unravel. Hospitals such as they were kept no mirrors, no polished water jugs. Even the metal of surgical tools was darkened. The soul, they said, clings to reflections when the body is weak. If it finds one it likes better, it slips away. And what if it doesn't find one at all? That was worse. Because the absence of your reflection didn't mean nothing was there. It meant something else had taken your place. A chilling story from a monastery in Ireland tells of a novice who, after confession, glanced at the polished side of the censer and saw no face, only smoke. He died the next week in his sleep. The censer was buried with him. A priest later wrote, "It showed his spirit, formless and vanishing." Historians still argue about the roots of this idea, Was it an echo of ancient Egyptian beliefs about the Ka, the soul's double, or was it homegrown, a reflection of fear more than theology? Either way, it became embedded in daily life. You never looked into a mirror when you were tired, or crying, or bleeding, because pain made the soul slippery, and if the mirror caught you, then you might look back and see nothing. Or worse, a version of yourself who smiles when you don't. One fringe belief even held that souls could be stored in mirrors on purpose, which, as it was said, trapped the spirits of animals, lovers, or enemies in shards of glass. These soul mirrors were kept hidden, wrapped in cloth, placed in boxes of herbs. Break the mirror, and the spirit was released or destroyed. A quirky superstition from the Carpathians warned against buying a mirror second-hand. You don't know who's inside, they said. There were even markets for cleansed mirrors, ones ritually purified with salt smoke and moonless water. In some cases, mirrors were buried with people face down. The theory, if the soul lingered, it would look down into the earth, not up at the living. But some souls got stuck. A tale from Saxony speaks of a girl who began to wither after gazing too long at herself during a thunderstorm. She said the mirror had taken her voice. She grew quiet, then pale, eventually mute. When the mirror was shattered, she spoke again. Her first words were, "It didn't want to let go. Even today, some of us feel it, don't we? That slight hesitation before meeting your own eyes in the glass. That strange flicker, was that just the lighting, or something else?" In the Middle Ages, they didn't have electricity, no LED tricks, no digital glitches, only candlelight, only moonlight, only memory, and mirrors, always the mirrors. So tonight, you pull the cloth down, just for a second. Your reflection blinks. So do you. But you can't help but wonder, what if you stopped? What would the mirror do? Would it keep watching? Would it finally blink alone? The artist dips his brush, not in paint, but in ash. His canvas is a slab of wood, warped and imperfect. The image he paints is a woman, face-pale hairs swirling upward like smoke, but her eyes are moons, silver, round, and endless. It's unsettling, and somehow beautiful. In the Middle Ages, art didn't merely reflect belief, it shaped it. And when it came to mirrors, and moonlight artists became record keepers of things too dangerous to say out loud. Walk through any medieval church, and you'll see light used like language, radiant halos, gilded saints, shards of stained glass that bleed colored light onto stone floors. But in secular art, murals, tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, reflections, and moons were where the symbolism got strange. Painters knew the moon wasn't trusted. It was rarely painted in full. Often it was partially clouded or off to the side like an unwanted guest in the background. And when it did appear clearly, it usually accompanied something uncanny. A pale night who never casts a shadow. A woman staring into a mirror that shows the back of her head. A child holding a candle that doesn't flicker. These were signals, clues to the viewer, because art was not just visual, it was whispered theology. And the whispers said light reveals, but also deceives. One 14th century manuscript called the Book of Mooned Faces, yes, real title, in Latin features over a dozen illuminations of people interacting with mirrors under moonlight. In each, something is wrong. The reflection is smiling when the figure is not. The figure's hands are visible, but the reflections are claws. In one chilling image, the moon looks through the mirror as though the sky itself were spying. Historians still debate whether these depictions were literal warnings or artistic metaphors. Some argue that the warped reflections symbolize the human soul twisted by vanity. Others suggest they're remnants of pre-Christian lore tales where the moon was a sentient force, a judge, a thief of forms. But the artists weren't random. They were commissioned by those who believed. One noblewoman in Burgundy famously paid for a fresco in her private chapel depicting Saint Michael not slaying a demon but breaking a mirror. Behind the cracked glass, dozens of tiny faces stared out. Her diary notes that she believed mirrors trapped regret and that only heavenly fire could free the soul. And there's more. A quirky detail from Eastern European tapestry work. Women wove moons into the border patterns, but always upside down. Why? Because the upright moon sees too much. To turn it was to blunt its gaze. Even sculpture reflected this discomfort. Gargoyles in certain cathedrals were carved holding small, mirrored shields, not to admire themselves, but to reflect back evil. These weren't cosmetic decorations. They were warnings: watch your light, watch your reflection. Some of the most debated pieces are the silent saints, wooden icons whose eyes are polished with wax to a shine reflecting just enough light to shimmer in a dim chapel. Some claim this was to imitate divine presence. Others say it was a deliberate trick, making the statues seem aware, just like the moonlit mirrors people feared in private. One alchemist painter, named Lucien de Mire, claimed that art under moonlight changes. He kept his paintings in a cellar by day, then moved them outside at night. He said their meanings shifted. Under the moon, the brush lies, he wrote. Under the mirror, it tells the truth. None of his original works survive, except perhaps the one you're staring at now, the one with the woman and her moon eyes. You look again, and you realize her reflection is not in the painting, only the mirror she's staring into. And in that mirror, something looks very much like you. It's raining now, soft, steady, a midnight hush across cobblestone and slate. You sit in the old inn's common room, fire dim, everyone long asleep. But curiosity keeps you awake. On the mantel, propped behind a row of dusty candlesticks, rests a mirror, small, oval, silver-rimmed. You hesitate, then reach for it, not to gaze, but to test something you've heard whispered all day, the mirror test. In the Middle Ages, mirrors weren't only feared, they were used, not for beauty, not for clarity, but for truth. The mirror test wasn't what we think of today. No psychology, no self-awareness studies. It was a kind of divination meets investigation, a way to uncover what words couldn't reveal. Whether someone was lying, bewitched, dead, or not yet. You hold the mirror at an angle, let it catch the firelight, then look just past your face. Nothing happens. Of course not. But that's the trick of it. You're not supposed to see yourself. You're supposed to see what shouldn't be there. In rural England, the mirror test was used to identify witches. The accused would be made to look into a mirror, usually silver-backed, blessed by a priest. If their reflection appeared distorted, delayed, or absent, it was considered evidence. If the mirror cracked, that was a confession. One surviving document from 1452 details the trial of a woman in Suffolk. She was forced to hold a mirror under moonlight. Witnesses claimed her reflection spoke with no sound and turned its eyes away from hers. She was hanged 2 days later. Historians still argue whether these accounts were hysteria fabrication or misunderstood optical effects, double glazing, candle flicker, warped glass. But the belief endured. It wasn't limited to witch hunts. There was a test for death as well. Before declaring someone truly gone, family members might hold a mirror under the person's nose. If the glass fogged, they still breathed. If not, final prayers were said. But sometimes the mirror did fog and the body still didn't stir. In those cases, people worried the soul was caught, held by grief, or by something else. And then there were ghost mirrors. You've probably heard this one. In modern form, stare into a mirror. In the dark, say a name. Wait for an image to appear. In medieval times, the practice was more formal, performed during the witching hour with very specific rules. The room must be silent, the mirror cleansed with ash and water, the name spoken only once. If the person's spirit appeared, it was supposed to offer closure. If anything else appeared, well, that was your problem now. A quirky tale from Bohemia tells of a man who used a mirror to find out whether his wife was faithful. He expected to see her reflection. Instead, he saw his own face, but older, bruised, crying. 2 months later, he fell from his roof. Whether it was guilt or gravity, no one could say. And here's the strangest part of all. Some believe the mirror test could be done on a home. Hang a mirror by the door and watch what it reflects. If it shows the inside, normal. If it shows the outside or moves before you do, the house is cursed. You should leave immediately. Monasteries used mirror tests during exorcisms, not to drive out spirits, but to confirm them. If the possessed could not meet their own gaze, or if their reflection shifted independently, they were marked. Even physicians performed primitive versions. One physician's manual from 1381 recommends using a polished mirror to check the eyes of fevered patients. If the pupil disappears in the glass, the spirit is absent from the body, it reads. Return them to prayer, or ash, always ash, the universal cleanser. You're still holding the mirror. The firelight behind you flickers, and just for a moment you think you see something, not a face, a blur like heat above a candle. Then it's gone. Maybe a trick of the light, maybe not. You place the mirror back gently facing the wall now, because the thing about a test is, you may not like the answer, and some questions should never be asked at night. You awaken to a sound you can't place, soft, wet, rhythmic. It takes you a moment to realize what it is. Breathing, but not yours. Slow, deep, not quite human, just beyond the doorway. You don't move, you barely breathe yourself. Then the sound fades, and the silence it leaves behind is heavier than the noise ever was. There's one thought pressing at your skull. It's a full moon, and your shutters are open. In the Middle Ages, the full moon wasn't just about dreams or madness. It was about transformation, not spiritual, not symbolic, literal, and nothing embodied that fear more than the werewolf. Forget silver bullets and Hollywood howling, those came later. In the medieval world, lycanthropy wasn't fantasy. It was a known condition recorded in legal documents, religious tracts, and witness testimony. A man could be tried for murder as a wolf. A woman could be exiled for birthing cursed children. All it took was the right sign and a full moon. But what does this have to do with mirrors everything? Because it was said that a true werewolf cannot be reflected, or if it is the reflection lags behind, or snarls, or smiles while the creature does not. That's why many villages used mirror tests to confirm suspected transformations. A man accused of lycanthropy might be brought before a silver mirror held during the moon's peak, his face observed under torchlight. If the reflection twitched late or blinked at the wrong time, or worst of all, didn't appear at all, he was considered marked. Not always guilty, but no longer safe. One tale from 13th century Brittany tells of a blacksmith who laughed too loudly during a blood moon feast. Suspicious, the villagers made him face a mirror in the chapel. His reflection smirked and turned away before he did. The next morning, his anvil was found cracked in half, and the mirror fogged with paw prints. Historians still debate whether these stories were metaphors for alienation or moral panic. Some claim lycanthropy was a way to explain antisocial behavior illness or trauma. Others argue it was a legitimate cultural diagnosis, a supernatural explanation for real horrors. But even beyond werewolves, the moon was thought to awaken the animal within. There are references to people crawling, growling, gnawing at wood. A monk in Saxony wrote of a novice who began biting his own shadow during moonlit vigils. His teeth were bloodless, but his soul was not, the entry reads. The novice was sent to a monastery with no windows. And yes, mirrors were always involved, because people believed that during a transformation, it wasn't the body that changed first, it was the reflection. One fringe theory from 15th century Prague claimed that all humans contain an inner twin, visible only in reflective light during a full moon. This twin was wilder, freer, more honest. For most, it stayed hidden. For some, it took control. A quirky superstition from Hungary held that if you stood between two mirrors under a full moon and looked into the infinite corridor, you'd see your animal face somewhere deep in the tunnel. Many tried. Few reported what they saw. One boy went blind. Another refused to ever touch water again. You shift now, eyes darting to the corner of the room where your travel mirror lies half covered by a cloth. You didn't mean to leave it out, and now you're not sure you want to touch it. Because what if you see something not a beast, not fangs, nothing cinematic? What if it's just your face, but hungry? What if it watches you when you turn away? What if it already has? Because in the Middle Ages, the moon didn't just shine. It summoned, it revealed, and the mirror, that's where the thing answers. So tonight, as the moon rises higher, you lie still, eyes closed, cloth over the glass, just in case, because you can survive a beast outside your window. But one inside your reflection, that's harder to kill. The first time you hear it, it's almost romantic. Two voices whispering under a willow near the edge of the village. A man and a woman leaning close beneath the moon. But when you step closer, you realize something's wrong. They're both weeping, and neither casts a shadow. You step back, slowly. In the Middle Ages, moonlight and love shared a curious, complicated relationship. On one hand, the moon was the patron of longing, of stolen glances, of secret kisses in garden courtyards. But on the other, the moon was a liar, a seductress, a trickster. It was said that lovers who met beneath the full moon were blessed by passion, but cursed by truth. Because moonlight, unlike sunlight, shows only half the story. The rest, shadows, illusion, regret, and the worst kind of romance. The one started by a reflection. There were whispered tales of villagers' men and women alike falling in love with what they saw in a moonlit mirror. Not with themselves, no. That would be simple. They fell in love with the other person they saw, a stranger in the reflection, one who appeared only when the moon was right. Some claimed it was their future spouse. Others believed it was a ghost, a spirit offering companionship. But more often, it was a trap. A 14th century court case in Toulouse recounts a noblewoman who refused 3 suitors. She said she had already chosen a man who visits me in the glass. When pressed, she described him: black eyes, red cloak, pale skin. No one knew him. When the mirror was removed from her chamber, she screamed for 3 days. The bishop ordered it broken. She fainted. Upon waking, she claimed never to have loved anyone at all. Historians still argue whether this was delusion madness or repressed desire. Some link it to the medieval concept of the incubus, a demon lover who visited in dreams and took form in reflections. Others think it was simply the result of long loneliness and low light. But the pattern held. Moonlight made lovers irrational. Mirrors made them tragic. A folk ballad from Brittany tells of 2 betrothed who saw their wedding reflected in a bowl of moonlit water. She saw joy. He saw fire. They argued. The wedding was canceled. A week later, she died of fever. He never married. The song ends with the line, "The moon lied to them both." There were even rituals for lovers desperate to see their fate. The most common involved a mirror, a candle, and the moon. One person would stare into the mirror while holding the candle. The other would sit behind them silent. The mirror was supposed to show the truth, whether their union would prosper, produce children, survive sickness. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. One couple in the German Alps tried it during a blood moon. He saw her reflection smile at him. She saw his turn away. He disappeared the next morning. They say she still walks the mountain paths, holding the mirror like a lantern. A quirky belief from Sicily warned women never to say a lover's name 3 times while looking into a mirror at night. Not because it summoned them, but because it trapped them. The name clings to the silver, the saying went. The man forgets her, but the mirror remembers. And yes, churches had thoughts. Monks wrote of lustful gazes and mirrors of the flesh. Nuns were forbidden to own reflective objects unless for practical use, like cutting hair or applying salves. Even then, they were to be covered after use. Temptation comes first in the eye, one abbess wrote, then in the moon. Still people hoped, because the moon was not only a liar, it was also a promise, that love could appear where none had been, that the mirror might reveal what the world refused to offer, that somewhere in the shimmering silver the heart could be answered. But you've heard the stories, and so when you pass the mirror tonight, bathed in pale light, the shutters forgotten, you do not speak, you do not ask, because if the mirror loves you back, it will never let you go. There's a grave near the edge of the village, not marked with a name, just a stone, flat gray cracked by frost. But if you dig beneath it, so they say, you'll find something strange. Mirror shards buried in a neat circle surrounding a skull. It's not a tale told often, only on cold nights, only in whispers. Because in the Middle Ages, when someone died badly, suddenly violently, or after seeing something they shouldn't, you buried the mirror with them. Not the one they looked into, the one that looked back. This wasn't common, but it wasn't rare either. Folklorists and graveyard records, when they exist, show a strange pattern across medieval Europe, pieces of polished metal or glass found in graves, often with no obvious reason. They weren't wealth, they weren't offerings, they were containment. You see, if a person died in front of a mirror, especially during moonlight, it was believed that part of them stayed. A breath, a thought, a trace of soul. And if that piece wasn't buried with the body, it might wander. So the shards were broken, blessed, buried. Some said it helped the soul remember where it belonged. Others claimed it prevented hauntings. But not all mirrors were broken. Some were buried whole. One chilling account from 15th century Poland describes a man who refused to sleep without a mirror above his bed. He died during a thunderstorm, mid-dream, mouth open in a silent scream. His family swore they saw his reflection still breathing. They removed the mirror, covered it, then buried it with his body. The priest objected, but not very hard. Historians still argue about these mirror burials. Were they spiritual, symbolic, or superstitious? Some claim they're echoes of ancient burial practices, where reflective objects served as guardians or guides. Others say they're just misunderstood accidents, shattered keepsakes mistaken for rituals. But the stories say otherwise. A quirky tale from eastern France tells of a mirror that shattered as its owner died. Each shard showed a different face, not hers. When the villagers tried to bury them, one piece refused to stay buried. It turned up days later, glinting in the hearth ash. They buried it alone under salted earth. In some regions, people went further. They placed mirrors inside coffins, flat against the chest. The belief was that the soul would see itself one last time and rest. But if the mirror cracked before burial, the funeral was canceled. The body was burned. One particularly unsettling variation, burying mirrors face down, so that what looks out cannot rise. A protection or a prison. And yes, there were curses. An Irish ballad warns of a woman buried with a mirror that hadn't been blessed. She walks with glass in her eyes, it sings, and shows you the thing you fear to see. Children were told not to look into puddles near her grave, especially under the moon. Even monks recorded these fears. A passage from a Cistercian journal reads, "We do not bless the looking glass. It holds what should pass. To bury it is mercy. To leave it is error." You glance now at your own reflection, just a glimmer in the window. The room is still, the fire low, but the moon is out, and you wonder if you were to die tonight, suddenly, silently soul, still tangled in thought. What would your reflection do? Would it wait? Would it mourn? Would it breathe long after you'd stopped? And if someone found the mirror tomorrow, would they bury it or hang it back on the wall? You visit a monastery perched high on a cliff, winds howling like forgotten hymns. The stone corridors echo with silence, broken only by the shuffle of sandaled feet and the occasional chime of a bell. But in the novices' dormitory, one thing stands out. No mirrors, not on the walls, not in the washroom, not even in the private cells. Instead, every doorway bears a symbol, a simple circle, with a line through it etched in ash. When asked, one monk simply says, "We guard the soul at night." You begin to understand. In many medieval monastic orders, especially among nuns and cloistered monks, mirrors were not just discouraged, they were forbidden. Not out of asceticism alone, but because of what reflection might stir, and especially after sunset. There was an old belief among the faithful that looking into a mirror after sundown invited the mirror to look back, that to see your face in low light was to risk seeing your soul unguarded, exposed to temptation, pride, or even possession. And in a monastery where the soul was everything, no risk was too small. One 14th century convent in France had strict mirror rules. Only the abbess could carry one, and even then only for practical needs, illness, grooming the dying, inspecting wounds. It was kept wrapped in linen and blessed weekly. Its case bore the inscription, "For light, not gaze." Why such fear? Because stories spread. A record from a Carthusian scriptorium tells of a young monk who broke his vow of silence by confessing he had seen his reflection praying differently than he was. It mouthed the words wrong, he said. It looked too pleased. The mirror was confiscated. He was moved to isolation. Historians still debate whether this represents early mental illness or metaphorical crisis. But to medieval minds, it was evidence the self untethered. A nun in a Milanese convent reportedly claimed her reflection began aging faster than she did. At first, it was dismissed, but when her mirror started showing moonlight when the room was dark, even the abbess believed. The glass was buried beneath the chapel steps, its frame burned. A quirky practice emerged in some orders. Instead of mirrors, bowls of dark water were used for washing their surfaces, constantly disturbed, so no reflection could take hold. The idea was that ripples confused the gaze, protecting the soul from stillness. And yet some rules were bent. Monks who practiced illumination, the painstaking art of illustrating sacred texts, sometimes used small fragments of polished metal to guide their lines. But these were held at odd angles, meant to reflect light, not faces. A mistake could mean weeks of extra prayer, or in one abbey public penance. One fringe belief held that Christ himself never used a mirror, and to do so was to imitate vanity, not divinity. This was debated fiercely in theological circles. One argument claimed that Jesus, being sinless, had no need to check himself. Another suggested that mirrors did not exist in his time in the modern sense, so the point was moot. Either way, the result was the same: mirrors were too intimate, too human, too fragile, especially at night. That's why in certain liturgical calendars, moon phases were marked alongside feast days. During full moons, some abbeys forbade personal reflection of any kind. Journals were sealed, candles dimmed, no prayers said near water. The fear was subtle but deep, that a reflection under the moon could capture the divine before it was ready. Because in those quiet cells, where nothing moved and every breath echoed with meaning, a reflection could seem like a conversation. And not all conversations are holy. So the next time you walk past a mirror after dark and catch your eyes in its glass, remember the monks and nuns who turned away, who whispered prayers and drew symbols, who knew long before psychology that staring too long at yourself might reveal something you weren't prepared to meet. Not a demon, not a ghost, just a part of you, lonely, unfinished, and watching. The old healer's cottage smells of rosemary and beeswax. Bundles of dried herbs hang from every beam. You're here for a tonic, maybe a charm. But what catches your eye is the mirror on her shelf. It's small, round, set into a wooden frame etched with strange symbols. And it's glowing. You point. She doesn't flinch. "That's my moon mirror," she says softly, "for reading what the body won't say." And just like that, the door creaks open on another forgotten corner of medieval belief medicine that used both mirror and moon. To the medieval healer, everything was connected: body, spirit, moon reflection. A person's illness wasn't just about humors or bad air. It could be hidden in their light, revealed in their image. So mirrors became diagnostic tools, and the moon an amplifier. One 13th century medical manuscript describes the mirror of vapors, a polished disc used to observe changes in the patient's complexion by candlelight and moonlight. If the reflection shimmered, the illness was said to be active. If it remained dull, buried. Of course, there was no real science to it. but the belief was firm what the patient couldn't confess the mirror might show. Some used it to diagnose melancholy, what we'd now call depression. If a person avoided their reflection or claimed it looked hollow, they were said to be in danger of slipping into the lunar trance, a kind of dissociation believed to be caused by moonlight weakening the soul's grip on the body. And it wasn't just mental illness. One French folk healer claimed she could detect pregnancy by placing a silver mirror near a woman's belly and watching how the moonlight bounced off it. If the light bends, the child grows, she wrote. Modern physics says otherwise, but still her patients believed. There was also a belief that moonlight revealed affliction. A fever might not show itself by touch, but the mirror could reflect the flush. Some claimed that eyes would shine unnaturally in the glass if a person was under the influence of poison, or worse, a curse. A quirky tradition in northern Italy involved placing a mirror under the pillow of a person with night terrors. The next morning, the healer would examine it for dream stains, strange patterns of breath or moisture. They'd interpret the shapes, much like reading tea leaves. See this line, one wrote. It bends toward sorrow, and the strangest practice of all moon mirrors for confession. Some clergy, especially fringe sects in rural regions, believed that a sinner's reflection would flicker during a full moon if their guilt was heavy. During Lent, penitents were sometimes brought before a mirror and asked to recite their wrongdoings. If the flame near the mirror danced too violently, it was considered a sign that more truth remained. Historians still debate whether these rituals were meant to detect lies or simply provoke confession through fear. Some say it was theater. Others argue it was empathy disguised as superstition, a way for healers to understand pain without forcing words. But not all mirror medicine was benign. There were warnings. Never use a mirror on a dying man. If his soul saw itself fading, it might panic and cling to the nearest body. There's a story from Flanders about a healer who tried this and swore the mirror cracked just as the patient stopped breathing. I saw him blink, she whispered, but only in the glass. Some mirrors were buried after being used on the sick, too full of suffering, one text explains. Others were rinsed in moonlit water and wrapped in wool to sleep off the pain. There was a belief that the mirror absorbed part of the illness like a sponge. Too much, and it would leak. And of course, no mirror was used twice on the same night. Too risky, too personal. You look again at the healer's mirror, it no longer glows, just reflects. But something about it feels heavy, as if it's watching you not with malice, but with memory. The healer sees your hesitation. Don't worry, she says. It only shows you what you already know. You nod. You leave. But that night in your room, as the moon climbs and the shadows deepen, you avoid every reflective surface, because sometimes the body lies, but the mirror under moonlight never does. The castle is nearly abandoned now, just a few caretakers, some creaking doors, and the chill of stone that never warms. You're exploring by torchlight, careful not to let the flames sputter out. The guide warned you don't stray from the group. You did. And now you're here alone in the Hall of Glass. It's not on the map, no sign. Just a narrow corridor that opened into a vast echoing chamber, lined with mirrors, dozens of them, some cracked, some spotless, some draped in velvet so old it crumbles at the edges, and at the far end a moon window, circular high, letting in just enough light to catch the glass. You don't like it, because each mirror reflects a different angle, a different light, and just maybe a different you. In the Middle Ages, it was said that some castles held mirror rooms, chambers used not for beauty, but for ritual. These weren't Versailles-style parlors of vanity. They were places of control vision and sometimes fear. One story comes from a Bavarian fortress where the Baroness insisted on keeping a room of 13 mirrors, all facing inward. She claimed that walking between them during a full moon allowed her to see her past sins. A monk sent to dissuade her later wrote, "She stares at herself until her eyes go white." Historians still argue whether this was early mental illness or a performance of penance, but fragments of her mirror room survive, each pane engraved with a different Latin word, dolor veritas mors, pain, truth death. In England, one eccentric lord is said to have kept a lunar lens, a large convex mirror that focused moonlight into a central pool. He claimed it let him see angels move. His descendants locked the room after he drowned in the pool, fully clothed, eyes wide. Why so many mirrors? Because multiplicity is power. In many folk beliefs, seeing yourself once was reflection. Seeing yourself many times was revelation, or madness. A quirky belief in 15th century Denmark claimed that mirrors placed in a circle could trap spirits. If one stood in the center, the spirit would follow itself in the glass and forget how to leave. Some castles kept such rooms sealed for this reason, alone a prison made of sight. Others used mirror chambers for prophecy. You'd sit alone, surrounded by glass under moonlight. Ask your question aloud. The first reflection to move wrongly held the answer. Instructions varied. Some said to fast beforehand, others to anoint your temples with ash and oil. Most agreed if all reflections moved together, leave immediately. Not every tale ends in terror, though. One castle legend tells of a woman who entered a mirror room every year on her birthday. She lit a single candle, said nothing, and left after an hour. Her life was said to be long, wise, and full of luck. The mirrors she claimed reminded me how many selves I carry, but always, no mirror in such rooms faced a door. To do so was thought to invite the outside in, and worse, to give something inside a way out. As you glance toward the exits, you notice a strange thing. Your reflection in the nearest mirror doesn't quite match your posture. It's just a half-second lag. Almost nothing, almost, and suddenly you understand. This room wasn't lost. It was left behind, locked, ignored its power, forgotten, but not gone. And you're standing in the middle of a story no one finished. Moonlight still flows through the high window. It touches one of the mirrors, just one, and that pane flares briefly, as if catching a signal, a memory, a breath. You back away, slowly, eyes forward, not turning. Because these mirrors don't just reflect the past, they hold it. And if you linger too long, you might become part of it. You don't remember falling asleep, but you wake to moonlight pooling across the stone floor like spilled milk. The castle is quiet. The mirror room is far behind you now, or so you thought. But there, across from your bedroll, is a small mirror someone left, propped against a wall. You don't recognize it. You didn't bring it. And yet it reflects your every breath, every blink, with unsettling precision. This is the end of the journey, but not the fear, because in the Middle Ages, the worst mirror wasn't the one that lied, it was the one that told the truth. There were many kinds of fear. Fear of transformation, of demons, of madness, of sin. But this was the fear of seeing yourself clearly under a light that never blinked. Moonlight. A priest in 12th century Italy once wrote, "The sun shows the body, the moon shows the soul, and mirrors show both if you dare to look." His writings were burned, his name forgotten, but the idea endured because people in that time didn't fear mirrors and moonlight out of ignorance. They feared them out of recognition. They understood in their own way that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what lurks in the woods or dances in firelight. It's what looks out from your own eyes when the world is silent and the moon hangs still. A quirky superstition in Wales claimed that if you stared into a mirror by moonlight for too long, you wouldn't go mad, you'd go honest. You'd confess things you didn't mean to admit. You'd realize truths you couldn't bury. The mirror, they said, would peel you. One man wrote that his mirror told him he'd never return from war. He smashed it, then went anyway. He didn't come back. Historians still debate whether medieval mirror fears were born of religion folklore or simply the human mind trying to make sense of itself. But they all agree on one thing: the fears were real as the glass in your hand, the breath fogging its surface, the face blinking back at you with just a little too much awareness. And so, as we draw this tale to its quiet close, you ease away from the mirror. You drape a cloth over it. You dim your lantern. Because even now, centuries later, some part of you understands moonlight is not soft. It is silver, sharp, peeling. And mirrors, they never sleep. Wind down 300 words. The room fades into softness now. The moon still lingers behind the curtains, but its glow is no longer cold. It is calm, gentle, like a breath exhaled after holding it too long. You've walked through forgotten halls, dusty cottages, trembling abbeys. You've glimpsed faces that did not belong, heard footsteps with no feet to follow them. You've stood before mirrors that blinked wrong, smiled too early, or waited too long to reflect what they saw. And yet, here you are, whole, quiet, still breathing. Let that be enough for tonight. You see, the Middle Ages weren't just haunted by superstition, they were soaked in it. Every fear was a shape, every shadow a possibility, every mirror a doorway. And in a world where explanations were scarce, the unknown was both terror and comfort. Because sometimes mystery is kinder than certainty. So as the last echoes of this journey fade, let them drift like fog across a sleepy field. Let the wind carry away the last flickers of fear. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. There is no reflection here now, no silver glass, no glowing moon, just the steady warmth of your body, the hush of your room, the soft hum of the world turning on. You're safe. The mirror is covered. The moon will set, and you are exactly where you need to be. Sweet dreams. 300 words. The room fades into softness now. The moon still lingers behind the curtains, but its glow is no longer cold. It is calm, gentle, like a breath exhaled after holding it too long. You've walked through forgotten halls, dusty cottages, trembling abbeys. You've glimpsed faces that did not belong, heard footsteps with no feet to follow them. You've stood before mirrors that blinked wrong, smiled too early, or waited too long to reflect what they saw. And yet, here you are, whole, quiet, still breathing. Let that be enough for tonight. You see, the Middle Ages weren't just haunted by superstition, they were soaked in it. Every fear was a shape, every shadow a possibility, every mirror a doorway. And in a world where explanations were scarce, the unknown was both terror and comfort. Because sometimes mystery is kinder than certainty. So as the last echoes of this journey fade, Let them drift like fog across a sleepy field. Let the wind carry away the last flickers of fear. Let your breath slow. Let your shoulders soften. There is no reflection here now, no silver glass, no glowing moon, just the steady warmth of your body, the hush of your room, the soft hum of the world turning on. You're safe. The mirror is covered. The moon will set. And you are exactly where you need to be. Sweet dreams. Word count 196 plus 306 or 1502